Patanjali's big assertion right there in the very beginning, the second verse, yoga is the stilling of all thought. Yoga's chitta vritti nirotana. Yoga is what happens when you endeavor or it naturally arises or you arrive at some kind of definitive point where the mind becomes still, where the mind becomes still. And maybe you can most readily relate to this just when you come out of Shavasana, right? Like problems seem a little less urgent, as does, things like self-identification, a little less urgent. There's more space in our view. And that's the direction this process of yoga is heading or heads. He then goes on to talk about what that's like. Then the seer is established in their true nature is what happens when the volume of our thoughts turn down. The seer is established in their true natures. At other times, at other states, get this, the seer appears the same as the fluctuations in the mind, Sutra 1.4. And then, where we're honing in, the thought, Panchataya klishta klishta. The thought waves are fivefold. Some, get this, some are painful, some are not painful, right? In other words, we tend to think in one of five essential ways. And of those, some of those are painful, klishta, and he goes on to define what he means by pain, right? It's a very specific set of criteria, and some are not. And the basic distinction is thoughts that have us feel more contracted, and separate are of the klishta variety or of the painful variety. When our identity does this. And I most recognize the hardening of identity in states like anger, for example. Anger. Does the sense of self becomes more expansive in states of anger or more contracted? More contracted. Or jealousy or envy or, depression for that matter, right? There's a natural condensing of self as opposed to, and it might help if I round out the picture here by presenting the other direction here, which is an expansion of self, which we may recognize more in states of empathy or love or compassion, or just standing in awe, like looking up at the night sky or over the edge of a Great Canyon or something like this, where it is possible for our sense of self to become broader and more full and more expansive. This is the aklishta direction. This is the non-painful direction. So thoughts are of five kinds. The first is called pramana. That means accurate or correct perception. The second is called, I'm blanking on it now, but it means incorrect perception. Incorrect perception, right? So by correct perception, we mean that, there's an accurate correspondence. I hold up three fingers. We all agree that there's three fingers being held up. That's correct perception. And this also happens on like a micro and individual scale, as well as a universal scale. So it's correct perception, incorrection, and then vikalpa is the place of imagination. And this is highly developed in the human being. The human being is particularly gifted, or so it's said in Vedic thought, at this capacity for imagination. And it's the ability to it's where we derive, it's out of imagination that we can formulate a vision of the future. If I do this and I do that and I do that, it's going to take me over here. Now, it's not always accurate, right? Like I imagine I go here, I imagine I go here, well, did indeed we arrive at this intended destination? Maybe, maybe not. But that faculty of envisioning the future and going about the tinkering process of experimenting or going through the steps is a product of this vikalpa or imagination. And it's also used not only for, figuring out how you're going to pay for your kid to go to college, or figuring out what how you're going to, navigate a work situation, etc. But it's also used in yogic or spiritual practice as well. So we draw upon this faculty of envisioning or so-called imagining some abstract spiritual principle. It can be also pointed in that direction. So like the infinite. Like I say that word infinite, and it's so elusive. Where do you even begin to kind of get a grip on that? Only in your imagination can we even begin to conceive of something like the limitless, right? The limitless, like where do I even begin, right? So that's what we're going to tinker with a bit, is kind of this broad propositions that only our imagination can take us to, right? And then the final two, I'll name them quickly, is nidra. So we've all heard of yoga nidra undoubtedly, right? So that's deep sleep. That's a thought wave. So when we sleep, we have some recording faculty. There's some measure of awareness still operating in deep sleep. And we know if we slept well or we didn't sleep well. And the last piece is smriti, or memory. Memory. And if vikalpa is responsible for future projections, smriti, memory, is responsible for past understanding, or what we call history, like draw from our memory banks and making present moment decisions. Or maybe a part of us is still kind of stuck in what happened back then, etc. That's stored in this smriti faculty within the mind. Yeah. Both of which, vikalpa, the one other characteristic that vikalpa and smriti, memory, have is they're both entirely subjective. They occur within the individual. Like my whole memory banks and my fantasies and are different than, vary per person. They're distinct. Whereas, correct perception is objectively agreed upon. Oh, okay. So all this is very difficult to wedge into an asana practice. Like asana, this is intended to be, I don't know, to give us a few landmarks to consider in helping us self-reflect. That's what I consider to be the deeper purpose of philosophy, is to help us orient and understand ourselves to a greater degree. And then practice is intended to, help support us in the realization of the principles or the assertions. Okay, and in this